And welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I'm Ben DeMono here talking to you today about Dan Simmons' novel Olympos. This is the sequel to his novel Ilium that I reviewed a couple weeks ago, and the second and final volume in that duology, so it wraps up the story. Now, given this is the sequel to an earlier book, of course we're going to get spoilers for both books, but I do want to briefly at the beginning address those of you who maybe haven't read either or have read Ilium and haven't read Olympos. So the beginning of this is going to be spoiler free, and then in the second part of the video I want to talk about a couple things that I think are not necessarily very well understood in a lot of the reviews and criticism of this book that I've read. So we'll address some of those in the second half, and of course that will be quite spoilery. Alright, so what do you need to understand about this book going in if you haven't read it before, or if you're looking to reread it? Well, the first thing you need to understand is that when Dan Simmons writes a sequel, the sequel is almost always drastically different than the original. And there's a few examples of this in his resume or his catalog or bibliography or whatever you want to call it. First being, Hyperion and Fall of Hyperion. This is maybe one of the more famous and drastic examples. If you've read Hyperion, it's based on, well, not based on, but it's certainly structured largely on the Canterbury Tales. And Fall of Hyperion is drastically different. It still carries forward the plot from Hyperion, but in a very, very different way. The characters we focused on in Hyperion aren't the same characters that we necessarily have a focus on in Fall of Hyperion, even though many of them carry forward. Summer of Night, his horror novel, is another great example. That book, I believe, has 3 different sequels, each one independent of each other, and each very different in tone and structure and content than Summer of Night. Those sequels are Children of the Night, A Winter Haunting, and Fires of Eden. So Dan Simmons kind of has this way where if he's going to write a sequel, he doesn't do what a lot of authors do, which is to just rewrite the first book. He goes in a very new direction, structurally, content-wise, oftentimes thematically. And that's very much the case here with Olympos. Well, Olympos, I think, thematically carries forward very strongly from Ilium. Its structure and focus is quite a bit different. There's a lot less focus on what's going on with the gods on Olympos, what's going on with the Trojan War, Thomas Hockenberry, all those people who certainly appear in Olympos, but their roles are much smaller. And another good example is Thomas Hockenberry is a first-person narrator through all of Ilium, and he's only a first-person narrator through the second half of Olympos, but we follow him in the third person. The first half. The focus of this book is much more on the old style humans and the things that are happening on Earth. And so there's a lot of those structural differences. So I think it's important to understand, because I think this is one of the things that throws people with this book, that you're not just turning the next page in Ilium and reading the next chapter. You are reading a new and different book that, yes, continues the same story, but is not the same book you were reading before. Second thing you need to understand is that if you made it through Ilium, you're no doubt aware that there's lots of literary puzzle, references and everything. The more knowledge you can gain of those sources, the more you're going to understand about what's going on in Olympos. A lot of what Simmons does in this book amounts to a literary puzzle. So I would highly recommend at least having a familiarity with the Ilium, or the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as Robert Browning's poem Caliban upon Setebos. I think those are the 3 that are the most essential to understanding Olympos, because lots of what's going on here that I think throws a lot of people with this novel is dependent upon kind of putting the pieces together from how this novel interacts with those three works. Okay? Thematically, this novel continues forward the whole sense of what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to be a man, from Ilium. It carries forward that rediscovery of humanity that we saw with the old style humans in Ilium. Okay? And that's really important. That's maybe the final thing I would say to those of you who are just sticking around for the spoiler-free section here, is that you have to understand what this book is about if you want to appreciate it. This book is not about global conflict. It is not about saving the world. It is not about figuring out what happened to the post-humans. It is about what does it mean to be human and what does it look like to recover humanity once it's been lost. Okay? And if you go in with that as your focus, you're going to enjoy this book a lot. Alright, so spoiler-free people, you're out of here. Now let's talk some spoilers. I think Olympos is a very difficult book in a lot of ways, whereas Ilium is I think a more or less straightforward read. Obviously it has challenging sections to it. Olympos is a difficult novel to figure out what to make of it. It is not satisfying in many ways, and I think that throws people. But you have to understand what Simmons is doing. So let's talk about a couple things and figure out why it isn't as satisfying and whether or not that should or should not be a bad thing. Okay? So, what I was just saying in the non-spoiler section, that the focus of this humanity, or of this novel, is on what it means to be human and the return of humanity, is very, very important. Because where people come away from Olympos feeling unsatisfied is that they're expecting this to be an all-out war between the Morvex and Setibus, the many-handed as a cuttlefish, the gods on Olympus. We're supposed to find out what happened to the old-style humans, what's Prospero's motivation, and the novel is about none of those things. It is about the old-style humans recovering their humanity. And you can say, well, that doesn't hold because Simmons introduces all those elements. Yes, but be careful. What Simmons is doing is he is replicating the structure of the Iliad in this novel. He's replicating that kind of old-style pre-Aeneid epic, to use some of C.S. Lewis's terms when he's dissecting the epic in his preface to Paradise Lost. He's really tearing all of that apart, and he's focusing on what is a relatively small story against epic backdrop. Okay? So in the Iliad we have this 10-year war for Helen of Troy, and this epic clash between the Greeks and the Trojans, and none of that is what the Iliad is about. The Iliad is about Achilles, Agamemnon, Priam, the battle between Achilles and Hector, and what it means for those characters in this very small slice of time within the Trojan War. The Iliad is ultimately unconcerned about what happens to Troy. We never get to the Trojan horse. It's not concerned about the motivations for what led all these people there. We get references to all those things, but at the end of the day, the Iliad has a hyper-focus on Achilles' story. And what happens to the Greeks when he leaves, and what happens to the Trojans when he comes back. And Dan Simmons is doing that exact same thing. So we have all these characters like Setibus, and the Quiet, and the Demogorgon, and the Post-Humans, and Prospero, and all these huge universal galactic events, and Dan Simmons chooses to focus on the return of humanity and that thematic question of what does it mean to be human, and that is that same small slice. Now, what does that mean for evaluating this novel? Well, it means a couple things. First of all, I think that to properly critique this novel, whether positively or negatively, you have to have that appreciation for what he's doing. And a lot of the criticism for this novel in reviews focuses on, and fan comments and whatever, focuses on the fact that, hey, we just kind of don't see the end of what happens to Setibus. It kind of trails out. We never quite get all of Prospero's motivations, and the fate of the post-humans is kind of left over here. And I would suggest that that's not a valid criticism, because you're not critiquing what Dan Simmons has actually done. That would be a valid criticism if he was writing within a standard novel structure, and he's not. He's writing in this Iliad-style structure, at which focuses on small events, not the large ones, and the large events are allowed to trail, to kind of just run their course outside of the actual narrative. Now, you can say that's unsatisfying, but again, that's the form he's writing in. So you can critique the form, but you can't critique it's nonsense to try and critique him for using a pre-existing form that's out there and that's been used in the Iliad and other old-style epics. You have to critique this book for what it is, not what you wish it had been, okay? Now, within that form, that's where I think analysis can take place. Does Dan Simmons overplay his hand a little bit by choosing to go with that form? Is it too unclear what he's trying to do? Is it, does he owe his readers answers because they can't find out those answers anywhere else? Whereas with something like the Iliad, we can find out the fate of Troy and other stories, whereas this is his own world. I think all of those are more valid questions because they're critiques that accept the form and then analyze how well Dan Simmons does within that form. And some of those questions I don't entirely have my mind made up on them. I think he might have overplayed his hand here a little bit. On the other hand, I think that some of that sense, for me anyway, comes from the fact that this is such an unexpected form in a modern novel that it really throws you for a loop. Once it kind of clicked for me what he was doing, I was able to appreciate it a lot more, okay? So I kind of going back and forth on that myself. You make up your own mind. Just all I'd say is that if you're going to criticize what he's done here, understand what it is he's done and why he's done it before you say there aren't answers to this and this and this. Well, of course there aren't, because the form he's writing in doesn't allow answers for this and this and this, okay? The other thing I would say, though, is that if you want answers to a lot of these things, I think that the answers are there for us in analyzing some of his source literature, and that's why I recommended things like Caliban upon Setibus, the great Robert Browning poem. I read that a few times. It's a fairly short poem, but I read through it a few times as I was reading Olympos, and that's where, if you're wondering what happens to Setibus and why does he just take off in a hurry, well, it's because the backdrop that Dan Simmons is drawing from comes from what Robert Browning's talking about there. So Caliban upon Setibus is Caliban's own monologue as he's reflecting on his evil little god Setibus, and Setibus, and then there's this other god mentioned called the Quiet in the poem, who Setibus is afraid of, and so if you read the poem and you have a good understanding of the poem, then you understand why Setibus just disappears at the end of Olympos, because the Quiet is on its way, and Setibus needs to get the hell out of here before the Quiet shows up. So it becomes a literary puzzle. And then maybe the final thing I would say here in this review, before we wrap things up, is that it's very important to not let whatever critiques you have with the form or dissatisfaction with the fact that this is the form Dan Simmons picked to allow you to miss the power and majesty of what he has done here, especially that theme of the recovery of humanity. One of the critiques that goes on in this novel is that Prospero and Miranda, I forget her other name, but we'll call her Miranda, the old lady who wakes up, the post-human who wakes up, I should say. Prospero calls Miranda. They send Harmon down into the Atlantic breach, and he comes across a sub, with all of the nuclear warheads and all the black holes that would have essentially taken out and destroyed the universe. And it's unclear, we never really find out why did Prospero and Miranda send him down there, and what was their plan to get him out and rescue him. He's ultimately rescued by the Moravex finding him, but if they hadn't found him, it seems like he would have died. And so it seems from our perspective that him going down there is pointless. Well, it's not pointless, we just, again, the form doesn't allow us that broader picture where we are able to understand what the ultimate plan would have been from Prospero and Miranda's perspective if the Moravex hadn't come along. But the point is that that's such an important scene thematically, because he goes in there and he listens to the recordings of the men who were on the sub and their plans to destroy humanity. And it's Harmon's rediscovery of original sin. And it's so powerful for the theme of this novel, because Harmon has to make the choice at that point. Okay, I have all this knowledge in my head now. I have fully recovered my humanity, and I've experienced the wonder of Shakespeare and art and literature and history and all this great stuff, and physics and science. And here's the other side of it, the great evil, the fall, the war, destruction, mindless violence. And it's the moment where Harmon has to decide, if humanity is recovered, we can't just take half of it. It has to be the whole thing. Very, very powerful thematically. It's an awesome, awesome moment in the novel. And so my advice would be, regardless what your opinion is on the form Dan Simmons used, don't let yourself miss those moments. This is every bit as much a powerful and philosophical novel as Ilium is, albeit one that is more challenging, less accessible, and perhaps for you, or for many readers, a bit frustrating at times because of how unexpected and unusual the form that he uses is. Personally, I think it's brilliant. Like I said, I don't have my mind entirely made up on whether or not he is fully successful with the form he uses, but nevertheless, this is a brilliant, brilliant novel. I think Ilium and Olympos are books to read and reread. They have a tremendous amount of depth in them. I cannot recommend them highly enough. 5 stars for both books, 5 stars for the series. These are Dan Simmons' masterpiece, well, among many of his masterpieces, but this is very much the best of what he's written. Alright guys, I'm out of here. This is Ben DiBono, Sci-Fi Christian. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.